If you could wake up tomorrow and find yourself in the year 1900, what would you see? What would you feel? Close your eyes and picture this. The world is still dark when you rise. The air is cold, and there's a faint smell of wood smoke lingering from the stove that never fully cooled overnight. No hum of appliances, no phone buzzing, no distant roar of traffic, just the silence of early morning, deep and real. There's no car waiting in the driveway, no radio waiting to be turned on, just your boots by the door, the sound of the floor creaking beneath you, and the knowledge that everything you'll do today will require your hands, your strength, and your time. This is America at the turn of the century. Welcome to Sleepy Town Radio, where the world slows down and memories come alive. In tonight's journey, we step gently into the year 1900, a moment suspended between the old world and the new, a time when horse-drawn wagons still rattled down muddy streets, but whispers of electricity and steel were already in the wind. This wasn't quite the Victorian era anymore, but it wasn't modern America yet either. It was something in between. Imagine waking up in a house lit only by kerosene or the first gray of morning light. The fire is already crackling because someone, usually the mother or the eldest child, rose early to coax the warmth back into the home. There's no hot shower waiting, just a wash basin and a rag. You dress in silence and lace up your boots, knowing your day will be long and likely hard. And yet somehow, there's a quiet beauty to it. You step outside, and there are no wires above you, no glowing billboards, no engine noise, just the sound of birds, and maybe the far-off clop of a horse's hooves pulling a milk cart down the road. In 1900, life moved at a different pace. It wasn't just the absence of technology. It was the presence of effort. Everything you wanted required doing. Water had to be hauled. Heat had to be made. Food had to be grown, stored, or bought with coin you likely earned by the sweat of your brow. But with that effort came a sense of knowing your neighbors, knowing your place, knowing the rhythm of seasons, and knowing how to survive. And yet, even amid this slower life, the air in America felt charged, not with electricity, not quite yet, but with change. You could feel it in the cities, in the clang of steel, in the factory whistles, and in the glowing gas lights that lit up Broadway after dark. You could feel it in the countryside, too, in the way the younger generation dreamed of something more, something beyond the old family farm or the general store. The nation was restless, eager, brimming with invention and tension all at once. It was a time when Isaac Newton's laws were still taught as gospel, and yet a young Albert Einstein was already scribbling down the ideas that would change everything. A time when most people had never heard of the word radio, and yet the first transatlantic wireless signals were just around the corner. It was a moment where you could still walk 5 miles and feel like you were traveling through time. Tonight, we'll explore what it truly meant to live in America in the early 1900s. Not just the big headlines, but the quiet details of everyday life. We'll visit small towns still clinging to 19th century traditions. And we'll walk the bustling streets of cities where the future was being forged in iron and fire. We'll sit beside children who never went to school, their hands too small, yet too essential to the factory floor. We'll share meals with families who knew how to make every scrap last. And we'll reflect on the resilience of people who carved life out of wood and earth, not just out of convenience, but we won't just speak of hardship. We'll find the joy, too, in porch swings and washboards, in Sunday socials and ragtime music drifting from an open window, in the way neighbors waved, and time was something you could hold, not chase. We'll remember the dreams that stirred even when the world was dimly lit and full of uncertainty, because somehow, even in a time without so much of what we now take for granted, there was still hope. There was still laughter. There was still life. So wherever you are tonight, tucked into bed, riding through sleepless hours, or just seeking a moment of calm, you're welcome here. You're welcome to drift with us through memories not of our own, but perhaps deeply familiar. Tonight, we return to a quieter America, a place of iron rails, dusty boots, hand-pumped wells, and hearts filled with quiet courage. Welcome to 1900, and welcome to Sleepytown Radio. And as you move through the stillness of that early 1900 morning, something curious begins to happen. You reach for ways to describe the world around you, and suddenly, you realize the words you might use today simply don't exist. There is no radio, because there is no such thing as tuning in. No movie theater down the road. No Blockbuster. No popcorn under the lights. No tractor waiting in the barn. Just a horse and a plow, and your own two hands. You've never heard of electronics, and certainly not television, vaccines, or psychology. The word feminist wouldn't mean much to anyone. And jazz? That sound hasn't found its name yet. Language in 1900 was simpler, not because people were simpler, but because their reality was shaped by what they could touch, see, and survive. There was no need to speak of wireless communication because nothing like it had ever existed. No broadcast, no headlines, no airwaves. Even the word truck was strange to many. And so, people spoke of what they knew. Weather and work, soil and seasons. They spoke in rhythms shaped by the land. Their vocabulary was full of tools and timber, of chores and church bells, of morning frost and evening lanterns. When you think about it, it's not just the absence of words. It's the absence of ideas those words would later represent. Without the word propaganda, how did people describe the sway of newspapers or the force of rumor? Without psychosis or schizophrenia, how did they make sense of suffering in the mind? Without cafeteria, what did they call the place where mill workers gathered for a hot meal? And without technology, how did they imagine a world run by something other than muscle or steam? These missing words weren't just oddities. They were markers of a world still in its infancy, not yet industrialized in the way we know, not yet awakened to the invisible forces that would soon define modern life. And there's something hauntingly beautiful in that, to live in a time before the noise, before the overload, to wake without a feed of endless headlines, to walk down a street where the loudest sound is the squeak of a wagon wheel or the laugh of a child running in bare feet. There was silence, there was space, there was slowness, but there was also mystery. Without all these modern words, people had to feel more and label less. They read poems by lamplight, not tweets by backlight. They told stories on porches, not podcasts in earbuds. They listened to the voice of the wind, not a satellite above. Words didn't fill every moment. And because of that, moments were allowed to be whole. Still, even in that quieter world, the language was beginning to stretch. Inventors scribbled in journals, searching for the right terms to describe what they were building. Writers crafted new names for the machines reshaping their cities. In classrooms and cafes, the vocabulary of the 20th century was being born, slowly, one invention, one discovery at a time. A boy might hear the word radio for the first time from a traveling salesman. A mother might read the word movie in a magazine and not know what it meant. And somewhere, in a quiet lab, the pieces of the modern lexicon were falling into place. It's easy, from where we sit now, to take these words for granted, to forget that someone had to live the world before they could name it. But that's what makes this moment in time, this moment in 1900, so fascinating. It is a pause between what was and what's coming, a breath between tradition and transformation. And just as the language was beginning to evolve, so too was the landscape, because while words like radio were just whispers, cities were rising, steel was being poured, and America was on the edge of something monumental. So let's continue. Let's step out of the home and into the world, across plains and rivers, across dusty farms and glowing city blocks. Let's see what life looked like in different corners of this growing nation, because while there may not have been words for everything just yet, there was no shortage of experience. And in the next chapter, we'll see just how many different Americas existed within one. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was already a vast country, stretching from the cobblestone streets of Boston to the redwood forests of Northern California. But it wasn't just the distance that made America feel big. It was the difference in how people lived, what they saw each morning, what they heard at night, and what they believed about the world. If you stood in the middle of Manhattan in the year 1900, you might have felt like you were already living in the future. Electric streetcars buzzed along the avenues. Buildings scraped the sky at 10 stories tall. Men in bowler hats shouted headlines from newspapers hot off the press. Shop windows glowed after sundown with the flicker of gaslight and, in some places, the warm hum of electric bulbs. You could buy silk from China and oranges from Florida. Elevators clanged open in department stores that felt like cathedrals of commerce. The streets were crowded, loud, alive. And above it all, rising between spires of brick and stone, was the skyline of a country hungry for more. But travel west just a few hundred miles, and it was a different world entirely. In the dusty hills of Wyoming or the misty timberlands of Oregon, a quiet kind of life still lingered. Children pumped water from a shared well. Mail came once a week, if the river wasn't too high. Wood stoves burned all day to fight the winter chill, and neighbors were counted not in dozens, but in miles. The roads weren't paved. Many homes had no indoor plumbing. Light came from oil lamps, heat from coal, and news from traveling strangers. It wasn't unusual for someone in Montana or the Dakotas to live their whole life without ever riding a train, even though railroads were slicing across the country like arteries of progress. And then there were the towns that didn't quite belong to either world, places on the edge, between wilderness and settlement, between past and future. You'd find them in Missouri, in Arkansas, in parts of Texas, where the roads were muddy, but the mines were sharp, where a general store also served as the post office, the bank, and the barber shop, where churches doubled as schoolhouses and Friday nights meant gathering in someone's barn to dance by lantern light. In these places, community wasn't a word, it was a fact of survival. That's what made America in 1900 so unique. It wasn't one story, but thousands. Not one voice, but a chorus of different tones, dialects, and dreams. In one state, a child might wake up to the rumble of streetcars and head to a public school in a red brick building with desks and chalkboards, while in another, a child would step into a one-room schoolhouse warmed by a stove, sharing lessons with students twice their age, learning from a teacher paid in corn or firewood. Some folks were already reading about skyscrapers and electricity in the newspapers. Others had yet to see a single bulb light up a room. It's easy now to think of America as one united whole. But back then, it was more like a patchwork quilt, stitched together by rivers and rail lines, held by stories and struggle. And for every place touched by industry, there were still pockets untouched by time, where front doors stayed unlocked, where chores came before breakfast, and where people didn't just live in their towns. They built them, shaped them, and passed them down. That divide between city and country, east and west, past and progress, wasn't just geographic. It was emotional. It shaped how people saw their futures and what they feared losing. City dwellers worried about overcrowding and pollution. Rural families feared being left behind. And everywhere there was this quiet tension, a question floating in the air like coal dust or prairie wind. Can we move forward without losing who we are? That question would come to define much of the 20th century. But in 1900 it was still just beginning to echo, because while the roads were uneven and the rails still didn't reach every home, America was changing, one brick, one beam, one whispered hope at a time. As the new century dawned, there were parts of America that surged forward, cities rising on steel beams, electric lights chasing away the dark, machines humming with possibility. But farther south, in the quiet valleys, the sun-baked fields, and along the dirt roads that ran through Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama, time had a different rhythm. It moved slower, heavier, as though it were dragging chains from the past that refused to let go. In these southern stretches, where cotton once reigned and the echoes of the Civil War still clung to the land, a quiet struggle continued. Not a war fought with bullets or flags, but one fought with debt, with silence, and with the long shadow of sharecropping. The sharecropping system was meant to be a solution, a way for poor farmers, both black and white, to work the land and earn a living. But in truth, it was something far more cruel. A trap disguised as opportunity. A poor family might rent a small plot of land from a wealthy landowner. They'd receive seeds, maybe a mule, and just enough food to get by. In return, they agreed to give a share of their harvest, usually half or more, back to the landowner at the end of the season. But here's the cruel part. The landowner kept the books. He decided how much the crop was worth. He decided how much debt remained. And somehow, no matter how hard the family worked, no matter how much cotton they picked, they always came up short. Year after year, they remained stuck, owing just enough to have to stay, living in weather-worn cabins with tin roofs and dirt floors. Children went barefoot in the fields. Meals were sparse. Cornbread, beans, maybe a bit of salted pork if they were lucky. Education? That was a luxury. When the harvest called, even young hands had to answer. For black families in particular, the system was especially unforgiving. Even though slavery had ended 35 years earlier, its ghost still lingered in these fields. By 1900, nearly 90% of African Americans still lived in the South, and roughly 80% of them were trapped in the sharecropping system. The names had changed. The laws were rewritten. But the power imbalance? It was all too familiar. Imagine waking each day knowing that no matter how much you gave, you'd never own the land beneath your feet, that your children might grow up to work the very same soil, under the very same terms, that the weight of history wasn't just behind you, it was on top of you. It's hard to dream under that kind of burden. Hard to feel free when every step forward costs more than you can earn. And yet, people endured. They found small joys where they could. In music passed down on porches, in Sunday church services filled with hope and song, in gardens carved from red clay, and in the stories they whispered to each other at night. Stories of a better life, of dignity, of someday. It's important to remember. This wasn't just a story of black struggle. Poor white families, too, were caught in the same web, scraping by, generation after generation, their lives bound not just by the soil, but by a system that made sure no one at the bottom could climb out, and still, they clung to pride, to family, to faith, to the belief that hard work meant something, even if the numbers never quite added up. In many southern towns, progress was a stranger. Paved roads hadn't arrived. Electricity was a rumor. Flush toilets? Only for the lucky few. Most homes were heated by wood stoves. Water came from a hand-pumped well. And when the sun went down, darkness returned. Real darkness. The kind where stars were sharp enough to cut. And the silence felt almost holy. It's easy, from the distance of time, to see the South of 1900 in black and white. A region lagging behind, defined only by hardship. But that's not the whole truth. There was resilience here. There was culture, deep, rich, uniquely American. There was a sense of place that ran deeper than property lines. And in every back porch melody, in every weathered hand tilling the soil, there was an unspoken strength, a refusal to be forgotten. And as the rest of the nation surged forward, the South would carry its burden and its stories into the new century. Some of those stories would be bitter, others beautiful, but all of them mattered because they were American. While the southern fields bent beneath the weight of tradition, up north, something very different was rising. Steel, stone, smoke, and the hum of ambition. This was the dawn of the American city, not just as a place to live, but as a symbol, a promise, a dream forged in fire and framed in iron. At the turn of the century, cities like Chicago, Pittsburgh, and New York weren't just growing, they were erupting. Upward, outward, skyward, steel had changed everything. Before, buildings were bound by the limits of brick and wood, structures only as tall as their own weight could carry. But with steel, we could build cathedrals to commerce, monuments to modernity. The skyline became our new frontier. And at the center of that movement was an architect named Louis Sullivan. They called him the father of skyscrapers. But he saw himself differently, not a builder of towers, but of ideals. He believed a building should rise like a proud and soaring thing, a reflection of the people inside it and the nation it stood for. His influence stretched from the offices of downtown Manhattan to the bustling heart of Chicago, where steel beams pierced the sky like declarations. But cities weren't just shapes and shadows, they were alive. You could hear them before you even saw them. The clang of trolleys, the hiss of steam, the layered rhythm of hammer, hoof, and human voice. People poured into cities by the millions. Immigrants, farmers, dreamers, drifters, all chasing a different kind of future. Factories lined the riverbanks and rail yards, their smokestacks rising like blackened trees against a pale gray sky. They made steel, glass, textiles, the very bones and breath of the industrial world. A man might start his day before sunrise, punching in with hands already worn raw. 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours of labor for $1 a day, if that. And yet, there was pride in that labor, a sense that he was building something, that maybe his children wouldn't have to. Tenements rose as quickly as the factories that fed them. Whole families crammed into 2 rooms with no plumbing, sharing walls so thin you could hear the neighbors breathe. Life was crowded, noisy, often filthy. But in the evenings, when the whistle blew and the sky glowed red from the sunset and the smoke, people gathered on stoops and fire escapes. They sang songs from the old country, shared stew from a single pot, told stories that kept them human. Cities had problems, of course, crime, disease, corruption, but they also had momentum. They represented the idea that America could become something more. Not just farms and flags, but engines and empires. They were messy and magnificent, crude and captivating, the living contradiction of a nation in transition. You could stand in a city street in 1900 and see the past, present, and future all in one glance. A horse-drawn wagon rattling past an electric streetcar, a child selling newspapers beside a man in a 3-piece suit, a lamplighter doing his rounds just as an arc light buzzed to life overhead. It was beautiful chaos, and it was new. For all its noise and grime, the city offered something the countryside never could. Possibility, a place where a name could be made, where ideas could spread, where anyone, at least in theory, could climb. You didn't need a title or land or lineage, just a sharp mind, a strong back, and a little luck. And for those who had known only stillness, the city's energy felt like a heartbeat, louder than anything they'd ever known. Still, not everyone was ready for the pace. Many longed for quieter places, for wider skies and slower hours, but even they knew America was changing. The city wasn't just a place, it was a sign that the future had arrived, smelling of coal smoke, lit by electric sparks and carried on steel rails. If the steel beams and smokestacks of the cities reshaped the skyline, then these next inventions quietly reshaped the soul of the nation, not with the roar of machinery, but with the gentle flick of a light switch, the click of a shutter, the quiet hum of something new. This was the dawn of a different kind of progress, not towering and loud, but intimate, domestic, and deeply human. Let's begin in a small, dark room. There's a single oil lamp flickering in the corner. A mother carefully lights a stove. A child squints at a book, eyes straining against the shadows. And then, With a twist of the wrist, a soft, steady glow fills the room. Electric light. Thanks to Thomas Edison, the filament had finally found its future. By 1900, electricity was still rare in most homes, but in cities, especially along the East Coast, wires began to snake across streets and ceilings, bringing a kind of magic once thought impossible. No more cleaning soot from chimneys. No more replacing cracked lantern glass. No more fearing the dark. Just the calm, even presence of light on demand. It changed everything. Evenings became longer. People gathered for board games, music, reading. Shadows danced softer on the walls. A new rhythm began to take hold. It wasn't just light Edison gave us. It was time. A little more to share, a little more to remember. And speaking of memory, that's where another invention stepped in. One that didn't make much noise at all. The Kodak camera. Small, portable, simple enough for anyone to use. You press the button, we do the rest, the advertisement said. And Americans did, by the thousands. For the first time, families could capture their own moments. Not just weddings and portraits in stiff wooden chairs, but Sunday picnics, a child's muddy boots, the dog sleeping by the fire. Life as it was, not just how it wanted to be remembered. Photo albums became treasured items, tucked into hope chests, shown to guests, handed down through generations. A frozen smile, a blurry horse, a mother hanging laundry. Each frame a tiny love letter to the ordinary. These inventions didn't just change what we used. They changed how we saw ourselves. The light bulb made us feel capable. The camera made us feel seen. Together, they brought a kind of intimacy to American life, a tenderness in the everyday. Imagine a winter evening around 1902. Outside, the wind howls over snow-covered fields, but inside a modest farmhouse. The parlor glows with electric light. On the table, a steaming pot of stew, a checkerboard mid-game, and a young boy holding his father's camera, waiting for just the right moment to capture the family dog wagging its tail. No radio yet, no screens, no noise, just laughter, warmth, and a click that would become a memory. It's easy to forget how quiet many of these innovations were, how gently they entered our lives, not demanding attention, but slowly, steadily changing the texture of each day. They didn't promise riches. They offered something richer, comfort, connection, continuity. And so, as the factories roared and cities rose, inside the homes of America, a softer revolution was taking place, one built on light, on photographs, on small wonders that stitched together the fabric of family life. As Americans grew accustomed to electric light and the quiet magic of the Kodak camera, another sound began humming in the distance. Not the clatter of horses' hooves, not the rhythmic rattle of a streetcar, but something different, lower, louder, mechanical. And then came the smell, oil, smoke, and something like possibility. The automobile had arrived. At first, it was a novelty, a rich man's toy, seen more often in newspapers than on dirt roads. Most folks couldn't dream of owning one. They were noisy, unpredictable, and expensive. People laughed at them, called them horseless carriages, and wondered how anyone could possibly trust a machine without reins. But that was before Henry Ford changed everything. With his Model T and the assembly line, Ford didn't just build a car. He built an idea that freedom wasn't something you inherited or something only the rich could afford. Freedom could have 4 wheels. It could sit in your barn. It could carry your family to the next town, or all the way to a better life. Imagine being a young farmer in 1905. You've worked the same fields your father did. Your days follow the sun. Your world a few dusty miles wide. Then one day, a neighbor rolls up in a Model T. The engine sputters and hisses, but his face is glowing. Suddenly, the next town isn't so far. The city doesn't seem unreachable, and the world feels open. That's what the car gave us. Not speed, but scale. Not comfort, but choice. Of course, the roads weren't ready. Most were unpaved. Bridges were unreliable. There were no gas stations, no road maps, no rules. But that didn't matter, because for the first time, ordinary Americans were moving under their own power. No schedule, no tickets, just a wheel, a key, and the horizon. The automobile began to change everything it touched. Rural towns got visitors. Cities grew outward. Motels, diners, repair shops sprang up like mushrooms after a storm. Even Sunday afternoons took on a new shape. Families would pile into their Ford, drive through the countryside, and call it a vacation. Wind in your hair, lunch in a basket, no destination, just motion. And like all great inventions, the car didn't just change transportation, it changed imagination. Children stopped dreaming of horses. They dreamed of engines, of speed, of escape. Love letters weren't just mailed anymore. They were delivered in person, on winding roads beneath the stars. But not everyone welcomed this freedom. There were those who missed the stillness, the slower rhythm of hoofbeats, the porch-sitting peace that now vibrated with the sound of progress. It wasn't just towns that were changing. It was time itself. Still, the automobile became more than a machine. It became a symbol, a promise that if you could just get behind the wheel, you could go anywhere. Start over. Break away. For a restless young country, it was exactly what we needed. So as the light bulb lit our homes and photographs filled our shelves, the automobile took us somewhere else entirely. Into the future, into motion, into possibility. And that humming sound in the distance, it never really stopped. The automobile gave us freedom. It opened the roads, stretched our lives outward. But while we were looking toward the horizon, another quiet revolution was happening. Not in distance, but in sound. A revolution that would make the world feel smaller and more connected than ever before. In the early 1900s, if you wanted to speak with someone far away, you wrote a letter. You dipped a pen into ink. You chose your words with care. And you waited days, sometimes weeks, for a reply. Communication had weight. It was deliberate, and often silent. But somewhere across the ocean, a young man named Guglielmo Marconi had other ideas. Using nothing but wires, waves, and stubborn genius, Marconi sent the first radio signal across the Atlantic in 1901. 3 simple dots. SOS. But what they meant was far more profound. We are no longer isolated. The air itself can carry our voices. It was like cracking open the sky and discovering it could speak. At first, the technology seemed like a curiosity, mysterious, even magical. People gathered in wonder as crystal radios caught whispers from distant lands. No wires, no ink, just a soft voice carried on invisible waves. For sailors lost at sea, it meant safety. For immigrants reaching Ellis Island, it meant news from home. And for Americans in rural towns, cut off by distance, weather, and the long silence of winter nights, radio became a kind of company. A warmth that came not from fire, but from voice. Imagine sitting in a small wooden house in Nebraska, miles from the nearest town. The wind howls across the plains. Your oil lamp flickers, and then a faint sound crackling from a handmade set in the corner. A piano melody. A man's voice announcing the news from New York City. Suddenly, you're not alone. You're part of something bigger, something national, something human. Though full-scale broadcasts wouldn't take off for another decade, the early 1900s laid the foundation. People began to dream of a future where voices could travel without paper or train tickets, where you could speak and be heard instantly, from one coast to another, from one world to another. And as with the light bulb, the camera, and the car, what began as a scientific marvel soon became a part of life. Families began wiring up antennas. Children gathered around headphones, listening for stories, music, or the weather. The radio wasn't just a machine, it was a window, a lifeline, a connection. For a nation built on vast distances, this new technology reshaped our sense of scale. The world didn't feel so wide anymore. You could be a farmer in Montana and still hear the opera in Boston. You could live in the desert and know the storm was coming 2 states away. The air had become a highway for voices, and we were just learning how to travel it. It's easy to forget, in our age of instant everything, how powerful that first connection was, how quiet the world once was. How loud it suddenly became, not with noise but with meaning, with presence, with someone on the other end. And so, as the wheels of progress turned on dusty roads and families stepped into their first automobiles, they also stepped into a new era of listening, of reaching, of knowing, of belonging. The world got smaller, and our hearts grew wider to receive it. There's a kind of silence that lingers underground. It isn't the peaceful hush of a quiet forest or the gentle stillness before dawn. No, this is a heavy, smothering quiet, the kind you feel in your bones, not your ears. And for many children in early 1900s America, that silence was the sound of childhood slipping away. By 1900, nearly 2 million children under the age of 16 were working in the United States, not mowing lawns for pocket change, not helping out in the family store after school, but truly working 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, in factories, mills, canneries, and deep within the mines. Their hands were small, nimble, and cheap. So while their peers today might have carried books and lunch boxes, these children carried shovels, hammers, and the weight of survival. Imagine a little boy named Samuel. He's 10 years old, maybe. His boots are too big, hand-me-downs from a cousin, but he wears them proudly. Each morning, before the sun even rises, he's already walking the dirt path to the breaker yard. He doesn't know what school is like, but he knows how coal dust feels in his throat. He knows the rhythm of the sorting tables, the sting of splinters, and the way your back aches before noon. Some days, he dreams of being somewhere else, anywhere else. But most days, dreaming doesn't come easy when your body is just trying to make it to the next hour. Then there's Mary, maybe 12, She works in a textile mill in Lowell. The whir of machines is constant, loud enough to dull your senses, constant enough to become the backdrop of your entire life. Mary stands for hours on end, tying threads and dodging the dangerous gears. One misstep, one moment of tired fingers, and an injury could follow her the rest of her life. Her hands should be shaping clay, painting in watercolor, holding the handlebars of a bike in summertime. Instead, they are raw, calloused, red from the dye that stains her skin. For many families, there was no other choice. Parents didn't want to send their children into such labor. They simply had to. Every penny mattered. Rent, food, coal for the stove. It all added up. And so, in the name of survival, childhood became a luxury, one that not every family could afford. It's important to remember, this wasn't hidden. Photographers like Lewis Hine captured haunting images of young boys with soot-covered faces and tired eyes, girls barely into their teens, standing beside machines nearly twice their size. These photos weren't just portraits. They were pleas, plea to the conscience of a nation, plea to lawmakers, plea to the very soul of what America promised to be. Reform would come, slowly. Child labor laws began to appear in some states, and voices grew louder, demanding education, protection, and dignity for all children. But in 1900, that future was still far away. Most children didn't have a childhood in the modern sense. There were no cartoons, no summer camps, no birthday parties at roller rinks. There were chores, early responsibilities, and the ever-present shadow of adulthood. And yet, even within this harsh world, glimmers of innocence survived. A marble found in the dust, shared between breaks. A lullaby hummed by a mother while darning socks by lantern light. A ragdoll stitched from leftover fabric. Moments of comfort and softness, quiet acts of love that reminded these children they were still children. And perhaps that is the most American thing of all. The insistence on holding on to hope, even when the world asks you to grow up too fast. As we look back, it's easy to feel sorrow, and we should. But we should also feel awe at the resilience, the quiet strength, and the seeds of change that were planted in those coal mines, factories, and mills, because those little hands would one day grow into the hands that shaped a better nation. And now, as the machines quiet and the day winds down, we turn the page to the next chapter, where voices rise, demanding change, and the long-awaited roar of reform begins. In the quiet wake of a century's turn, as soot-stained hands folded at supper tables, as coal-black lungs exhaled softly under woolen blankets, and as tired eyes closed on another long, bitter day, a sound began to stir, not loud at first, but growing. A low, steady rumble in the heart of America. It was the beginning of the progressive era, and it started not with a shout, but with a whisper. From the weary, the wounded, and the wide awake. By 1900, the cracks in the American promise had become impossible to ignore. Children, like we've just remembered, were laboring in mines and mills. Immigrants were packed into tenements with no light, no ventilation, and no future in sight. Food was unregulated, meat spoiled, milk watered down. And if you got sick, well, there were no safety nets, no public health care, no workplace protections, just the luck of the draw. And amid this tangled mess, the American conscience began to stir. It was a time when reformers, journalists, politicians, preachers, and everyday citizens rose up, not to tear down the dream, but to rebuild it, stronger, fairer, more humane. One of the first great voices of the era was that of President Theodore Roosevelt. He was bold, sharp, and deeply aware that power without purpose was empty. He didn't just want progress for the few, he wanted it for all. Roosevelt's Square Deal championed the ordinary American. The worker, the small business owner, the child too small to speak for himself. He cracked down on monopolies, preserved vast stretches of wilderness, and laid the groundwork for the modern regulatory state. But he wasn't alone. Across the country, investigative journalists, called muckrakers, began pulling back the curtain. They walked into meat-packing plants, into slums, into political machines, and wrote down what they saw. They told the truth, plainly and without apology. Perhaps the most haunting of these accounts came from Upton Sinclair, whose novel The Jungle painted a horrifying portrait of the meat industry. Spoiled meat laced with chemicals, filthy floors, rats and roaches crawling freely, workers injured, unnoticed, families poisoned, unknowingly. Sinclair had set out to expose capitalism's cruelty. Instead, he ignited a food safety revolution. Within months of The Jungle's publication, the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act were passed. The government would now be a watchdog, not just a bystander. This was the rhythm of the progressive era. One injustice exposed, one law passed, 1 inch forward. Women, too, began rising with a different kind of strength. They organized, marched, gave speeches in crowded squares and quiet churches. They demanded the vote, but also cleaner streets, safer workplaces, and schools that taught not just facts, but fairness. The suffrage movement was still decades from full victory, but the seed was planted in this fertile, difficult soil. And while Washington passed laws, change also came from the ground up. Settlement houses opened their doors in the poorest neighborhoods, offering education, food, and medical help. Labor unions grew louder, demanding fair wages, shorter hours, and dignity for every worker. Public schools expanded, cities built playgrounds, libraries reached into working-class neighborhoods. America was beginning to look at itself, not with shame, but with determination, because to love your country, truly, is not to pretend it is perfect. It is to believe it can be better. Still, not everyone was helped. The reforms of the progressive era were uneven and often left behind people of color, rural Americans, and the poorest of the poor. But a new direction had begun, one that said, children should be in school, not factories. That food should nourish, not poison. That government should protect, not just govern. It was, in many ways, the growing up of a young nation, not yet wise, but willing to learn. And so the murmur of change grew into something louder, a roar for reform, not a perfect roar, but a necessary one. As we move now into the next chapter of this slow, steady transformation, we look into the shadows cast by segregation and inequality, and the stories of resilience that would not be silenced. Let's continue the journey. The sun had risen on a new century, but for many it cast a longer shadow. As some Americans moved forward into promise and progress, Others found themselves held back, trapped beneath the weight of laws written not in ink, but in fear. These were the years of Jim Crow, when segregation wasn't just a Southern reality, but a national wound. You could see it in the schools, where black children were handed worn-out textbooks, pages yellowed and torn, while just across town, white students opened books fresh from the press. You could see it on trains, with whites-only cars trimmed in polished wood and colored cars nearer to the engine, filled with smoke and cinders. You could see it in the drinking fountains, the lunch counters, the voting booths barricaded by poll taxes and impossible literacy tests. But most of all, you could feel it. A system designed not only to separate, but to humiliate, to remind every day who held the power and who was meant to stay quiet. And yet, even under the weight of Jim Crow, there bloomed something powerful: resilience. Black Americans built institutions of their own: schools, churches, businesses, newspapers, places where voices could rise, where young minds could grow, and where dignity was not granted but claimed. Booker T. Washington, born into slavery, founded the Tuskegee Institute, believing that education was the path forward even within the confines of segregation. His message was one of patience and self-determination. "Cast down your bucket where you are," he said. "Find strength in the soil beneath your feet." But not everyone agreed. U.E.B. Du Bois, born free in Massachusetts, believed patience alone was a prison. He called for immediate equality, for the talented 10th to lead the way, for protest, for progress, for a nation to live up to its founding promise. Two visions, one shared hope, and through it all, there was music. There was gospel on Sunday mornings, the sound of choirs rising from wooden pews. There was jazz on Saturday nights, spilling from front porches and back alleys, defiant, joyful, alive. Even in towns that barely made the map, Black Americans made culture and history that echoed far beyond their borders. But the danger was real. Lynchings were not a thing of the distant past. They were newspaper headlines, photographed horrors, acts of terror carried out in public, sometimes with entire communities looking on. The sheer cruelty of it all is hard to speak aloud, but it must be remembered, because silence is how these things happen again. Still, through violence and systemic oppression, Black families continued to build. They tended to land when they could get it. They saved for their children's futures. They taught, not just how to read and write, but how to endure. They held on to love, onto faith, onto the quiet belief that someday something better would come. There's a kind of courage that doesn't march or shout. It sits at the kitchen table long after the dishes are done. It walks children to school knowing the road is not safe. It sings lullabies even when the world doesn't feel gentle. This too was America in 1900. As the century continued, the foundations laid in those years of struggle would give rise to the civil rights movement. But for now, change came slowly and at a terrible cost. Still, something had been planted, a seed of resistance, watered by hope, buried in soil that knew both sorrow and song. As we leave this chapter, let's carry with us the truth that even in the harshest corners of history, people found ways to live, to create, to believe. And in that, there is beauty. The fight for dignity, for justice, for a better tomorrow. That was one side of the story. But for most Americans in 1900, life was not lived in speeches or headlines. It was lived in the quiet rituals of ordinary days, in worn aprons and cracked boots, in early mornings and long, calloused evenings, in a rhythm shaped by the seasons, not by machines. A home in 1900 was not a place of comfort in the way we might think today. It was often cold in winter, hot in summer, and dim all year round. Most houses were heated with wood or coal, if they were heated at all. Fireplaces and cast-iron stoves took center stage, providing warmth, but also the constant worry of fire. There were no light switches, no hum of a refrigerator, no click of a microwave, just the flicker of kerosene lamps, the creak of wood beneath your feet, and the scent of whatever was simmering on the stove, which was often the same thing for days. Water had to be pumped or drawn from a well and carried, bucket by bucket, into the house. Laundry? It wasn't a chore. It was a full day's work, boiling water over the fire, scrubbing on a washboard, hanging clothes to dry in the wind, and hoping the weather held out. There was no detergent, just lye soap. Homemade if you were lucky, bought in small chunks if you had the extra cents. Chores were endless, and everybody pitched in. Children gathered eggs, swept floors, split kindling, and helped tend the garden. There were no after-school activities, because for many, there was no school. Just the work that needed doing before sunset. In town, folks rose with the sun and went to bed not long after it set. Clocks mattered less than daylight. Time was kept by the crow of the rooster, the rhythm of the train whistle in the distance, or the church bell tolling noon. Meals were simple, hearty: baked beans, cornbread, salt pork, fresh if you had a garden, preserved if you didn't. Meat was a luxury. Sugar was rationed. Coffee was often stretched with roasted chicory root, but there was grace in it. A kind of unspoken blessing in gathering at the table, even if the meal was thin. Because meals weren't just about food. They were about pause, connection, gratitude. And yet, for all its hardship, there was an odd kind of peace in the predictability of it all. You knew your neighbors. You trusted your horse. You understood the soil. You didn't expect life to be easy. You expected it to be yours, built with your own hands, earned by your own effort. That sense of agency, however modest, was powerful. In the evenings, if you were lucky, you might sit on the front steps, watching smoke curl from the chimney, listening to the creak of the porch swing. Perhaps someone strummed a banjo. Perhaps someone read aloud from a worn book. The sound of a baby cooing. The bark of a dog at something unseen. Nothing extraordinary, and yet everything that mattered. No, everyday life in 1900 wasn't gentle. It was labor. It was endurance. But it was also rooted in something we've almost forgotten: presence, being where you were, with what you had, doing what needed doing, together. And as the oil lamp was turned low, and the last embers in the stove gave off their glow, people rested. Not always well, but honestly, tomorrow would come early, and it would ask just as much of them. Life in 1900, America moved at a pace you could walk, and nowhere was that pace more tender, more human, than in the quiet corners of small towns scattered across the countryside, you wouldn't find much bustle. Just a general store, a blacksmith, a church with a whitewashed steeple, and maybe, if the town was lucky, a one-room schoolhouse with a bell that rang across the fields. Let's begin with home. Most houses were modest. Wooden frames, tin roofs, drafty in winter, sweltering in summer. No indoor plumbing, no insulation, no central heat. But what they lacked in luxury, they often made up for in warmth. Not the physical kind, but the kind that came from people who relied on one another. Families gathered around a hearth in the evenings, the only source of heat and light after the sun dipped below the trees. The fire would crackle as someone mended a shirt, someone else peeled apples for a pie, and a child read out loud from a well-worn Bible or a dog-eared reader. The smell of wood smoke clung to everything. Your clothes, your blankets, even your dreams. Bedrooms were shared, often with several siblings. A feather mattress if you were lucky, a straw tick if you weren't. Windows rattled in the wind. Roofs leaked sometimes. But the quilt was thick, and someone had stitched it with love. That counted for something. Outside, life was seasonal. You planted in spring, worked hard through summer, canned and chopped wood in fall, and prayed for mercy during the long, hard winters. Neighbors helped each other raise barns, mend fences, or bring in the hay before the storm hit. You knew the people who lived down the road, not through screens, but through handshakes, favors, and shared burdens. And when the chores were done, when the sun rose over the frost-lined hills, children set off on foot to a place that shaped their lives as much as home did. The one-room schoolhouse. Imagine it now. A small wooden structure at the edge of a field, a potbelly stove smoking in the corner, rows of desks carved with initials from decades past. One teacher. All grades, all subjects. She might have been 16 herself, teaching children only a few years younger, reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and history, all taught with chalk and slate. Older children sat toward the back, younger ones near the front. If you finished your lesson early, you helped someone else. There were no bells except the one you could hear from the belfry. No clocks, just the sun through the window. And no excuses. You came to learn and to become something more than the land you came from. It wasn't easy. Some children missed weeks to help on the farm. Others never learned to read past the Bible. But for many, the schoolhouse was the first step toward a life that might look different from the generation before. And still, education was not just about books. It was about values. About sitting still, listening well, respecting your elders. About learning to live together in a room where every child mattered, and every voice could be heard when it was time to recite. These small towns were more than just places to live. They were ecosystems of memory, of tradition, of community. You knew the storekeeper's name, the preacher's sermons, the songs sung at funerals and weddings alike. There was gossip, yes, but also generosity. If your barn burned, the town showed up with hammers. If you lost a child, the church bell tolled for you. And everyone brought a pie or stew without needing to be asked. It's easy to romanticize it now. And yes, there was hardship. There was loss. There was loneliness too. But in those warm hearths and simple schoolrooms, in the clink of the lunch pail and the scratch of the chalk, you'll find the roots of a country still learning what it meant to be a community. And as dusk crept back across the small town sky, and the last log in the stove crackled to ash, a child somewhere curled beneath a homemade quilt, whispering their times tables to the stars, believing perhaps that the world might be bigger than what the window showed. Before there were glowing screens and endless broadcasts, before living rooms flickered with motion pictures or radio voices filled the silence, there was a different kind of entertainment in American life, one made of porch swings, fiddle strings, and the sound of bare feet on creaky floorboards. Evenings were slower back then. After a long day's labor, whether on the farm or in the shop, families gathered close, not around a television, but around each other. The light came from oil lamps or kerosene lanterns, and the stories, they came from memory. In many homes, someone could play an instrument, a harmonica, a fiddle, maybe even a pump organ if you were fortunate. Music wasn't something you consumed, it was something you made. A father might hum an old Civil War ballad while sharpening a tool. A mother might sing softly while knitting by firelight. Children learned rhythm from clapping games, and rhymes chanted at play. Music was always there, woven into life like thread in a patchwork quilt. And then there was ragtime. By the early 1900s, this lively, syncopated music was sweeping through towns big and small. It drifted from the pianos of saloons and parlors, from sheet music printed in bold ink and sold for a dime. Scott Joplin's melodies, playful and haunting, became the soundtrack of a changing America. Young people would gather at community halls to dance, the rhythm tapping out through wooden floors and grinning feet. No speakers, no recordings, just sound and soul. But not all joy came from music. Some of it came from books. Dog-eared novels passed between neighbors, stories read aloud by candlelight as the crickets sang outside the open window. A favorite pastime in many homes was storytelling. True or tall tales whispered across rocking chairs as children lay on the floor, wide-eyed, drinking in each word like honey from the comb. Communities created their own forms of amusement. There were pie socials, barn dances, quilting bees, simple gatherings where food was shared, songs were sung, and neighbors laughed until their sides ached. If you lived near a town with a bit more bustle, you might take a weekend trip to Coney Island or a similar boardwalk to ride a carousel, taste saltwater taffy, or hear the calliope echo over the waves. Even in the rugged West, people found their version of fun. Rodeo shows, traveling circuses, and the occasional vaudeville troupe pitching a tent in the dust. Entertainment wasn't constant or curated. It wasn't streamed. It was seasonal, spontaneous, and shared. You waited for the fair. You saved up for the dance. You told the same jokes and sang the same songs year after year, and somehow they never got old. And yet, there was a sweetness in the quiet, too. A walk after supper, barefoot through the garden rows, fireflies blinking in the dusk, a mother reading psalms as her children nodded off, the shuffle of a rocking chair, the low whistle of wind under the eaves, and the sense that, though life was hard, it was whole. For many Americans, the idea of fun wasn't grand or expensive. It was tied to togetherness, to moments that didn't need a battery, a signal, or a subscription. You found it in the familiar, in the rituals of leisure handed down through generations, a Sunday picnic, a hymnal sung in harmony, a fishing trip with Grandpa where the talking mattered more than the catch. As America stood at the edge of a new century, the ways people entertained themselves were about to change forever. Soon, phonographs and radios would fill the silence. Later, movies and screenplays would paint new dreams onto the minds of children. But in that final moment before the electric hum took over, entertainment looked a lot like life itself. Quiet, homemade, and lit by the gentle flicker of lamplight. And as the night deepened, you might have heard a lone fiddle still playing through the hills, or laughter trailing down a dirt road, or the sound of someone, somewhere, singing, not for an audience, but for the simple joy of being heard. As fiddles quieted and front porch laughter faded into the dusk, a very different kind of sound began to echo through America. The shuffling of tired feet on wooden docks, the murmurs of unfamiliar languages carried on salt air, the sigh of steamships pulling into New York Harbor. This was the sound of arrival. At the turn of the 20th century, more than 1 million immigrants entered the United States each year. They came from Italy and Ireland, Poland and Russia, Greece, Hungary, and beyond. Most of them poor, hungry, and hopeful. They left behind crumbling cities, famines, persecution, and war. They came for work. They came for freedom. They came for a chance. And their first glimpse of this new world was often the Statue of Liberty, standing tall in the bay like a promise carved from copper. Ellis Island was where that promise met reality. Stepping onto the island felt like crossing into a dream, until the questions began. Your name? Your health? Can you work? Do you have a sponsor? Doctors watched for limps and coughs. Clerks tried to understand thick accents and strange names. And many names, proud ancestral names, were shortened, mangled, or lost forever in translation. Families were sometimes split apart. A mother held back for illness, a father deported for lack of funds, while their children cried in a language the guards couldn't understand. Still, most were allowed through. And from that small island came a wave of humanity that would change the face of America. Immigrants settled in the cities first. New York, Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia. Tenements rose like brick forests, cramped and unlit, with 12 people in a single room. Garbage filled the alleys. Soot blackened the windows. Water was scarce. Hope was not. Men took jobs in the worst conditions, digging tunnels, hauling coal, laying track. Women sewed until their fingers bled, or took in laundry for pennies. Children sold newspapers, shined shoes, or worked in factories to help feed the family. And yet, despite the hardship, they built neighborhoods, they formed churches, they opened shops where the old country lived again in spices, silks, and song. Little Itali's, Jewish quarters, German bakeries, Chinese laundries, each one a thread in the growing tapestry of American life. There were tensions, of course. Established Americans, many only 1 or 2 generations removed from immigrants themselves, feared the newcomers. They said they wouldn't assimilate, that they were too foreign, too Catholic, too Jewish, too un-American. Laws were passed to limit who could come in. The Chinese Exclusion Act had already begun closing doors, and whispers of eugenics and quotas would grow louder in the years ahead. But still they came, because hope is louder than hatred, and the hunger to belong is stronger than any wall. What does it mean to become American? That was the silent question every immigrant carried with them. Was it speaking English without an accent? Changing your name? Sending your sons to war? Or was it simply working hard, loving your family, and believing that tomorrow could be better than today? For many, identity was a balancing act, a dance between two homes, two tongues, two sets of memories. You might speak Yiddish in the kitchen and English in the schoolyard, pray in Latin but play baseball with the neighborhood kids, hang a flag on the porch on the 4th of July, but still cook your grandmother's stew every Sunday. And so, America became a mosaic. Not a melting pot where everything blended into sameness, but a patchwork quilt of languages, colors, customs, and dreams. Each immigrant group brought something essential, a flavor, a rhythm, a story. They didn't just join the nation. They built it, brick by brick, song by song, step by weary, determined step. As the 1900s progressed, many of these new Americans would be swept into the industrial machine. They would face harsh labor, discrimination, and hardship. But they would also form unions, fight for rights, and ensure that their children, born on American soil, would inherit not only the struggle, but also the strength. By now, the old country was a fading photograph on a mantle, the language spoken only in whispers. But the values remained: hard work, family, faith, resilience. And the question of who gets to be American? Well, that would echo far beyond Ellis Island. Tonight, as we remember the voices and footsteps of those who arrived long ago, let us also remember what they brought with them. Not just labor, but legacy. Not just culture, but character. They gave this nation more than their hands. They gave it heart. The gears of industry never sleep. By the early 1900s, the pulse of America could be felt in the tremble of the ground near the steel mills, in the clang of hammers on the rail lines, and in the steady cough of coal smoke drifting above factory roofs. Progress was everywhere, so was pain. The great factories, once symbols of hope, soon revealed their darker truths. Inside their walls, men worked 12-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week, often for barely enough to feed their families. There were no sick days, no vacation, no pensions. If a man lost a hand to a machine, he lost his job. If he died, his family lost their income. There were no benefits, no insurance, just a knock on the door and silence. In textile mills, children stood for hours at the looms, their tiny fingers prized for delicate threads. In mines, boys crouched in tunnels barely wide enough to breathe, hauling coal buckets under the weight of darkness and dust. In meatpacking plants, immigrants worked ankle-deep in blood and ice, surrounded by the stench of rot and the scream of machinery. It wasn't uncommon for a worker to leave home in the morning and never return. No headlines, no lawsuits, just another cog in the machine, replaced before the whistle blew again. One of the most haunting reminders of unchecked industry was the Johnstown flood of 1889, still fresh in the nation's memory by 1900. It wasn't caused by nature, but by negligence. A wealthy hunting club, frequented by Pittsburgh's elite, neglected to maintain the South Fork Dam, which held back a man-made lake high above the working-class town of Johnstown, Pennsylvania. When the dam finally gave way, 20 million tons of water surged downhill, destroying everything in its path. Over 2,100 people died. Homes vanished. Children were swept from their parents' arms. And when the mud settled, not a single member of the club was held accountable. Progress had its price, and it was paid by the poor. But out of the soot and sorrow, something stirred. It began with whispers in factory break rooms, handwritten flyers posted on brick walls, late-night meetings in church basements and saloons. Men and women, exhausted, underpaid, and expendable, began to organize. The labor movement was born in pain, but it grew in courage. Unions like the American Federation of Labor, AFL, began to take shape, pushing for better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. They faced resistance, not just from companies, but from the law itself. Strikes were often met with violence. Police beat picketers in the streets. Hired thugs destroyed union halls. And yet, they persisted. One of the most infamous early clashes was the Haymarket Riot of 1886 in Chicago. A peaceful rally in support of workers turned violent after a bomb was thrown at police. Shots were fired, blood was spilled, and the public, already nervous about foreign agitators, turned against the very people fighting for fairness. But not all hope was lost. Each protest, each walkout, each petition, however small, chipped away at the old order. Slowly, painfully, the idea that workers deserved dignity began to take root. By 1900, child labor laws were still rare. Workplace safety was still a dream. But the seeds had been planted. A new awareness was emerging, one that recognized the human cost of unchecked industrial growth. And while the gears of industry kept turning, they now did so under watchful eyes. As the 20th century marched forward, journalists would begin to shine a light into the darkest corners of American labor. Men like Lincoln Steffens and Upton Sinclair, writers who refused to look away, would force the public to confront what lay behind their cheap meat, their fast railways, and their glowing light bulbs. Change would come, not quickly, not kindly, but it would come. Tonight, as we sit in our quiet homes and listen to the crackle of a virtual fire, it's easy to forget the cost of the comfort we enjoy. But behind every modern convenience, from the lights in our rooms to the safety on our job sites, there is a story of someone who fought and someone who fell. Let us remember them not as victims, but as voices. Voices that refused to be silenced. And in remembering them, may we better understand what it truly means to move forward. Not just with machines, but with conscience. The dawn of the 20th century brought more than machines and megacities. It brought ambition, not just the kind that built skyscrapers, but the kind that looked beyond America's borders, toward distant islands, unfamiliar lands, and the unspoken promise of empire. By 1900, America was no longer just a collection of states. It was becoming something larger, bolder, hungrier. The Spanish-American War of 1898 had been brief, barely 4 months, but it reshaped the map and America's sense of itself. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines were no longer faraway names in textbooks. They were now tied to the stars and stripes. President William McKinley, known for his measured tone and soft manner, found himself at the helm of a nation with new global responsibilities. And then, on a quiet September day in 1901, He was shot by an anarchist at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. McKinley's death thrust Theodore Roosevelt, young, energetic, and fiercely assertive, into the White House. And with Roosevelt came a new philosophy: speak softly and carry a big stick. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a worldview. Under Roosevelt, America no longer sat on the sidelines of world affairs. It stepped forward. In Panama, the U.S. helped orchestrate a revolution to break the region away from Colombia, all to secure the land needed for the future Panama Canal. A bold, risky move. The canal would connect oceans, but it also symbolized something deeper: the belief that America could shape the world to fit its vision. Across the Pacific, things grew more complicated. In the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. took control of the Philippines, a nation that had fought its own war for independence. But instead of granting that independence, America imposed its rule. The Philippine-American War followed, brutal and largely forgotten in American memory. Tens of thousands of Filipino lives were lost, and American soldiers returned home not to parades, but to silence. It was a troubling chapter, a reminder that expansion wasn't always noble, and progress didn't always wear a clean face. Even closer to home, Roosevelt flexed American power in quieter ways. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine declared that the U.S. had the right to intervene in Latin America, to preserve order, to protect investments, to guide the hemisphere. But not everyone welcomed that guidance. To some, it felt like protection. To others, it felt like control. Meanwhile, America's Navy grew larger. Its presence felt from the Caribbean to the South China Sea. The world took notice. The U.S., once a frontier nation of small towns and wide-open plains, was now a global force, armed with steel ships and steel resolve. But while flags were planted on foreign soil, back home, not every citizen felt the glory. Many questioned the rush toward empire. Wasn't this the land that had once rejected colonialism? Voices like Mark Twain, once a fierce patriot, became outspoken critics of America's new imperial turn. "I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land," Twain wrote. He wasn't alone. Still, the march forward continued. Newspapers called it the American Century, and for many, that promise seemed real. A time of booming industry, expanding borders, and influence abroad. But for others, it raised harder questions. What was America becoming? And what, if anything, was being left behind? As we near the end of our journey tonight, this chapter reminds us that progress is rarely simple. Nations grow, yes, but growth leaves shadows, and ambition, if unchecked, can blur the line between leadership and dominance. America stepped onto the world stage in the early 1900s not as a quiet observer, but as a bold actor, shaping policy with ships, deals, and diplomacy. Sometimes for good, sometimes with unintended harm. Tonight, in the calm of your own home, as the breeze stirs the curtains and the warmth of the room holds steady, it's easy to think of America as always having been powerful, always steady. But back then, it was all new and uncertain, and filled with decisions that would echo for a century. Let us remember that chapter not just through headlines or treaties, but through the quiet tension of the time, when a young country, still unsure of its place, reached far beyond its borders and tried to become something greater. Whether we look upon that moment with pride or with pause, we remember it as part of our story, messy, mighty, and deeply human. The year 1900 now lies far behind us, tucked away in yellowed photographs, forgotten train tickets, and stories passed down in quiet living rooms. And yet, in the still moments of night, when the house is hushed and the lights are low, it sometimes feels as if you could still reach out and touch it. That simpler world, that slower world, that harder world. It was a time before convenience, when everything had to be earned, before screens and signals, before cars buzzed by and cities climbed toward the clouds. It was a world of lantern light and washboards, of butter churns and wood stoves, of letters that took weeks to arrive and neighbors who knew your name. And while progress marched forward, reshaping the nation in steel and smoke, not everything was better left behind. Back then, people understood the rhythm of the seasons, not just the pace of a clock. They listened to the land. They worked it with bare hands and sunburned skin. Children played outside until the shadows stretched long across the fields. And when night came, they didn't fight the dark. They leaned into it, gathered around the fire, and rested. There were hardships, yes, deep ones. Poverty was common. Disease took too many. Coal dust settled into lungs. Ovens had to be stoked. Water drawn by hand. But in the middle of that struggle was something quiet and profound. Connection. Families sat together every evening, not distracted, not rushed, just together. They shared food and stories and silence. They wrote letters, full of meaning, not messages made to disappear in a blink. When someone visited, it was an occasion, a gift, a reason to put on the good shoes. And in every small town, on every dirt road or cobbled street, there was a sense of place. Homes weren't big, but they were theirs, built by hand, filled with quilts and rocking chairs and the smell of soup on the stove. Front porches were where people watched the world go by. A horse-drawn cart, a neighbor walking home, or nothing at all, just the wind in the trees. The world didn't need to be exciting, it just needed to be. There was beauty in the ordinary, and time to notice it. We remember that world now, not because it was perfect. It wasn't. It was unfair in many ways. Segregation cast long shadows. Women's voices were quieted. Workers were exploited. Children were overburdened. But woven between those threads of injustice were threads of resilience, of courage, of dignity in daily labor. And even now, over 100 years later, that thread remains. It winds through our memories, in the way we fold a dish towel or fix a fence or nod to a neighbor. It's in the smell of fresh bread, in the creak of an old screen door, in the quiet pride of doing something the hard way, because it's the right way. What have we gained since then? Speed, access, comfort. Our homes are bright. Our food is easy. We can fly across the world or summon groceries with a tap of a finger. The lights never go out, unless we ask them to. And every answer is just a search bar away. But what have we lost? We've lost quiet. We've lost patience. We've lost the dignity of slowness. We've lost the kind of time that isn't measured by productivity, but by presence. We rarely sit still. Not really. Not without reaching for a screen or checking a clock. We fill every silence with noise, every gap with content. But back then, silence was the content. Stillness was sacred. It wasn't empty. It was full of life. The people of 1900 didn't know what was coming. The wars, the inventions, the revolutions. They just lived, day to day, hand to mouth, with their feet in the dirt and their hopes in the sky. And maybe that's what we envy most. Not their tools, not their troubles, but their ability to be present, to notice the smell of wood smoke, to feel the weight of the sun after a long day, to sit with their thoughts or with someone else and not need to do anything. Sometimes I wonder what they'd think of us now. Our glowing screens, our tangled wires, our constant movement. Would they be impressed? Probably, but I imagine they'd also ask us, when was the last time you looked up at the stars? When did you last sit on your porch and do nothing at all? Do you still know your neighbor's name? Do you remember how to fix things with your hands? Do you ever let the house go quiet and just listen tonight as you lie down and close your eyes? Let yourself drift backward, not into a fantasy, but into a feeling, a world lit by kerosene, a front porch with a creaky step, a rusted mailbox with a handwritten letter inside, a quilt pulled tight against the chill, a town that sleeps when the sun goes down. Let the wind carry you back to a time when the pace was slower, when the world was quieter, and the night belonged to rest, not to worry. And as we leave this journey through the early 1900s, may we carry a little bit of that quiet with us. May we make time for stillness, for story, for memory. And perhaps, as the fire crackles and the shadows stretch, you'll find yourself not so far from that front porch after all. So rest easy, friend. The world can wait. Close your eyes, breathe deeply. You're safe. You're home. And somewhere, the year is still 1900. Thank you for joining us tonight at Sleepytown Radio. We'll be here again soon, waiting with another story, soft and slow, from a time long ago. Until then, sleep well, dream sweet, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.